Duncan Polley coaches Australia, not for sport, but for the love of our stunning inland. And he takes a hands-on approach to sharing with others the breathtaking beauty of rugged red gorges, the splendid sweep of Spinifex plains, and the timeless tranquility of the lazy outback rivers, and the awesome evidence of nature's hand in changing a marine reef into a mountain range. To some, the inland may seem empty and lonely, but Duncan Polley knows better. He knows that it richly rewards those who seek out its sights, its sounds, and its secrets. Duncan has come a long way since he started coaching Australia. More than 3 million kilometres in fact, since he first drove his first tour in 1959. And even further, since he started the tiny Tin Can Bay bus service out of an old gold mining city of Gympie back in 1956.
Good afternoon, Polleys.
These days, as head of Polley's coaches, he doesn't really have to do any of the driving. But don't try suggesting that to him. No sooner has he returned from one of his safaris than he's making plans for the next, determined to ensure that for his passengers, getting away from it all means not only seeing, but experiencing. In our 29-day Across Australia expedition, we'll travel 13,000 kilometres in considerable comfort, roughing it just sufficiently to feel the quiet but mighty heartbeat of the real Australia that lies somewhere between Brisbane and Broome. So, let's get started. Cruising across the Darling Downs and Maranoa, after picking up our Sydney contingent in Toowoomba, some of the city-dwelling passengers feel they're already getting away from it all. But by comparison with what's in store, the scenery's positively crowded. Comfortable farmhouses, ordered paddocks, checkerboard crop patterns, a far cry from the true outback for which we're headed. Bassett's Romaville Winery at Roma wets our thirst for history. At the turn of the century, Romaville was Australia's largest single vineyard. Badly run down by 1975, it was bought and revitalised by David and Joy Wall. And now we're really heading into the mulga. That's the Aboriginal and common name for small, spreading acacia. And the capital of Queensland's mulga country is Charleville, billed as the gateway to the west. The handsome old Corones Hotel and the former National Bank are reminders of the days when wool was the king of the Australian economy and wealthy graziers made Charleville their social and financial headquarters. Heading now for the southwest corner of the state, famous for its heartbreaking droughts, we're amazed to see the area looking so green, and we count ourselves fortunate that we're going to see the inland at its very best following the most bountiful rain for many years. We're well into the Channel country now, and although from the ground it's hard to envisage the vast maze of channels formed when the area's 4 major rivers spread out in flood time to water the 4 million hectares, we can see that this remote corner can indeed be a Garden of Eden, Australian style. After a grim reminder of past tragedy, we have our lunch on the banks of Cooper Creek, where a spoonbill is already busy lunching, and we have the opportunity to admire lots of other bird life. Some creek the Cooper, surely the only one in the world which has 5 rivers flowing into it, yet which itself is often dry or just a chain of waterholes. Once it was the Barcoo River, and for a short time, the Victoria River. The Aborigines knew this complex river system as the Barcoo, a name said to mean two, as in two rivers. But the white men who tried to map the watercourse that sometimes disappeared into the sandhills and at other times joined up to form vast lakes found themselves up the proverbial gum tree. Call it what you will, Cooper Creek has always flowed strongly through Australia's history. As if to remind us that we're heading for the red centre, we run through a patch of sandhills, spectacular against the clear blue sky and complemented by the occasional green tree. Birdsville, and we're really getting away from it all. Or are we? Some of us elect to sample the nightlife at the famous pub, where the ringers come in from the outlaying stations every couple of weeks for a drink and a sing-along. Next morning, we take in the sights of this legendary frontier town, including the stark contrast between pioneer and present-day transport, before heading out over the Diamantina River and past the racetrack where every September Australia's most famous outback race meeting is held. Deserted now, but come September, it'll be another story. And now, we're on the Birdsville track, once notorious for its roughness and its hazards, and still demanding respect. But with Duncan's experienced hands on the wheel, the terrors of Sturt's stony desert and the hardships of those who challenged it seem comfortably distant. We're fortunate too to see the track both dry and wet. All this water lying around in such a traditionally dry area amazes us and gives our crew plenty of opportunity to record a sight that is rarely seen in Sturt's stony desert. One particularly muddy stretch tests Duncan's skill and results in a vacancy for a window cleaner. Heading down into South Australia on the historic route taken by the drovers to the railhead at Maree, we come across the big artesian bore at Mirramitter. The waters of the Great Artesian Basin, probably more than any other factor, made it possible for the arid interior of Queensland and parts of New South Wales and the Northern Territory to be used for grazing. Many outback towns use water from the artesian bores for their reticulated supplies, and in some cases, one has to wait for it to cool down rather than heat up before showering. We see another reminder of the split personality of Cooper Creek in the punt M.V. Brennan. It was presented to the settlers north of Coopers Creek by Dalgety and Company in 1949 to ferry people, supplies and mail across floodwaters and to assist drovers with the crossing of cattle en route to the Adelaide markets. As we near the end of the Birdsville track at Maree, a steep hill just off the road presents Duncan with a challenge and our film crew with a good angle. Northwest now, and we catch a glimpse of the southern part of Lake Eyre. A rare sight this, as the lake is seldom filled with water and is usually a wasteland of saline mud partly covered with a thick salt crust. As we skirt this strange body of water, which at its lowest point, when dry, is 16 meters below sea level, we understand why it's sometimes called the Sump of Australia. It was our intention to travel via William Creek and then cross to Coobapedy, but part of this road has been closed by water, so we've had to detour via a longer route, joining the Stuart Highway at Pimba. This road runs through some desolate country, reminding us of the daunting prospect facing the explorers and the surveyors who opened it up. Arriving late at Coober Pedy, we're keen to look around one of the world's greatest opal-producing areas. But that'll have to wait. Right now, we're more interested in getting out of the cold wind and into our underground dugouts, where we'll be warm and snug. The name Coober Pedy comes from the Aboriginal Cooper Pity, white man's burrow, and although we welcome the warmth of the dugout, it's the ferocious summer heat that forced the early miners to carve out their homes underground. Now many homes, tourist accommodation, and even churches are underground. And all this burrowing has given Coober Pedy a moonscape appearance when viewed from the air. In the morning, we visit the opal cave near our dugout to see how opals are cut and polished.
What we have to do now is to give it strength. We do this with a piece of man-made potch, which we call vitrolite, or a piece of our more common opal. This gets glued to the back, giving us our 2 layers. 2 layers being doublet. Which one do you think would be the gem grade chopper? Doublet.
The other one, I'm playing.
Next, we drop in, as it were, on the beautifully finished Catholic church. Then see the tunnelling method used on a house under construction. Joining the Hard Hat Brigade for an inspection of an opal mine, we meet a miner whose stories impress on us the uncertainty of the mining game.
To give you an example, my particular case, I've been mining for four years and we haven't found anything yet, so...
Oh, you poor thing.
Yeah, but
Only 4,900.
6 years ago I found $200,000, so that made up for it. So this is what it's all about. And
On then to sample some gracious living Coober Pedy style. Marla Bore, where the drovers once watered their stock on the long treks across the country, is now a topping up stop for our thirsty denning on the way to Ayers Rock. No matter how often one visits Uluru National Park, the rock never fails to stun the observer with its awesome mass. A good way to come to terms with its immensity and improbability of this giant sandstone monolith rearing up from the level desert plain is in an around-the-rock joy flight in a helicopter. Most people think of Ayers Rock and its sister feature, the Olgas, as having been somehow pushed up from the surrounding plain. But according to the latest geological theory quoted by the park authorities, the reverse is the case. Ayers Rock and the Olgas are now thought to be the only above-ground portions of a huge bed of sedimentary rock, some 100 kilometres across and several kilometres deep, that has eroded away, except for the hardest and most erosion-resistant portions. These we see as Ayers Rock and the Olgas, or as the Aboriginal traditional owners know them, Uluru and Katajuta. Although the climb from the base to the cairn on the summit is only 1.6 kilometres, some sections are extremely steep. Of the 18 deaths recorded on Uluru, 13 have been from heart attacks and 5 from falls. The 8 members of our group who made the arduous climb were rewarded with a superb 360 degrees view of endless plains, broken only by the bulk of Mount Connor to the east and the Olgas to the west, living up to their reputation for fascinating colour and perfectly fitting author Robin Davidson's description, a cluster of lavender pebbles on the horizon. There's a wealth of interest and information in any of the many walks that can be done at the base. On the Marla Walk, for instance, we learn that Uluru is a name applied to a waterhole on top of the rock, and now applied to Ayers Rock itself. And as we study some of the many examples of cave art, we find that we're not alone in being unable to estimate their age. The art sites have been the subject of much guesswork, and confusion for many years. Park authorities say much of it is probably ancient, but just how ancient, nobody knows. No one has yet been able to find a way of accurately dating cave art without destroying it. And sadly, the cave art at Uluru is in danger of disappearing before its mysteries can be solved, thanks to the effects of exposure, not only to the elements, but to the moisture and grease from countless hands. As we continue to explore the natural features at the base of the rock, we gradually come to sense some of the mystic force that has made Uluru sacred to its traditional owners. Each feature, be it cave, rock waterhole or gorge, has its own dream-time significance. Many of the caves around the base of Ayers Rock have a characteristic overhanging lip of the same weathered rock so familiar on the surface of the monolith. Inside the lip, the rock has a much fresher, dark grey appearance, showing that the weathering process has been much slower. It is this weathering or rusting that has given the rock its famous reddish tinge. At Mutajulu, we have the chance to inspect more of the mysterious cave paintings. Mutajulu is the Aboriginal name for Maggie Springs, one of the main waterholes at the base of Ayers Rock. And it's also the name of the Aboriginal community on the eastern side of Uluru. In the late afternoon, we make the obligatory trip to Sunset Strip to watch the colours of the rock change dramatically. A magnificent spectacle which puts the perfect finishing touch to a memorable day at Uluru. But although we're in the so-called dead heart of Australia, there's opportunity even here to enjoy first-class cuisine and top entertainment. A night out at the Sheraton Yulara provides an astonishing contrast to the sights and sounds we've experienced during the past week. Although the distinctive outline of the Olgas is almost as well known as that of Ayers Rock, the vegetation is a surprise to many. Lush tropical plants grow in the sheltered ravines between the rocks. From a distance, though, it's easy to see why this group of giant monoliths seem to explore Ernest Gillies like 5 or 6 enormous pink haystacks, all leaning against each other, or the backs of several elephants kneeling. The immense dome-shaped rocks, numbering about 30, range in height up to about 450 metres above the desert plain, with the summit of Mount Olga 1,069 metres above sea level. The Aborigines know the Olgas as Katajuta, meaning many heads, and like Uluru, the area is particularly sacred to them. Leaving the Olgas behind, we find ourselves following, although in considerably more comfort, the footsteps of the camels with which a young Queensland woman, Robin Davidson, trekked from Alice Springs to the Western Australian coast in 1977. Just how vital camels were in this remote, harsh country was tragically demonstrated by the fate of gold-hungry Henry Lassiter, and we turn off the road to see the cave in which he sheltered for about 25 days in 1931, after his camels bolted, stranding him without food. Weak with starvation, he set out to walk the 140 kilometres to Mount Olga, hoping to meet his relief party. Carrying 1.7 litres of water and assisted by a friendly Aboriginal family, he managed to cover 35 kilometres, but died in the sandhills, leaving behind an unsolved mystery about the fabulously rich gold-bearing reef he claimed to have discovered. After the sombre story of Lassiter's fate, Two of our passengers introduce a welcome note of light relief. Jack Frame of Chinchilla on the Western Darling Downs recalls some of his old skills with a stock whip. But judging by his nervous expression, Brisbaneite Bill Hay is not entirely convinced of his competence. Docker River country, and we're charmed by the wildflowers that remind us that inland, although lonely by urban standards, is never empty of beauty and interest, and that getting away from it all isn't much use unless you're prepared to seek out the things that make the bush so special. After crossing the border into Western Australia, we reach Giles Weather Station, billed as the most remote in mainland Australia, where a staff member gives us a rundown on the procedure involved in releasing one of the 4 weather balloons sent aloft every day to gather weather data used in preparing the weather forecasts watched by millions of TV viewers.
What we've got here is a balloon filled with hydrogen, and the hydrogen will lift the balloon at about 300 meters a minute to about 26 kilometers before it bursts. Underneath the balloon we've got a little radar reflector. We actually try and shoot down the reflector with the radar, firing electron beam at it. The electron beam hits the Temperature 18.5 degrees. When the wind blows, you have a hell of a job doing this.
At Giles, they have on display the nose cone of a Blue Streak rocket fired from Woomera in 1960, and which after crashing to Earth was recovered near Giles in 1980. The grader used by surveyor Len Bedell's construction crew on the Gun Barrel Highway reminds us that tomorrow we'll be heading along this famous dead straight road pushed through the Spinifex Plains to service the Woomera rocket range. Memories of wet roads are far behind us now, and the bull dust that is the curse of inland drivers who venture off the bitumen billows high, thick and choking around our coach.
The afternoon was free for us.
A lunch stop gives us time to contemplate the pitiless harshness of the Great Victoria Desert and to conjecture on how this ultimate survivor met its death. After more than a week on the track, we've now become well practiced in setting up a bush camp in the mulga. Before we hit the sack though, we enjoy a friendly yarn around the campfire.
That's good.
Hey! We just had a big feed.
And Duncan's co-driver Bill Pike shows us some slides taken on earlier safaris.
Yeah, these slides are relative to a lot of the country we've been through, and you'll recognise a lot of places that we've been over the last few days, okay?
Morning sees Duncan busy as usual. This quiet, unassuming man has a knack of getting things done without fuss, in the best tradition of the Australian bush. Whether he's helping hostess cook Ella Randall with breakfast or doing some maintenance on the coach, Duncan always has things well in hand. And it seems a pity to have to pull down our Ellis tents after such a short stay, but we have a long day ahead of us, 735 kilometres to Wiluna. At Leonora, Duncan pulls into an old pub, but it's the coach's thirst that is slaked, not ours. The former pub is now a Shell service station. welcoming us at Walloona Caravan Park is Boxer, and further along the road we see some of his cousins in the wild. We're seeing much more wildlife now, including plains turkeys or bustards. We admire some of the wildflowers for which Western Australia is famous. We're now in the Pilbara, a region fabulously rich in minerals, mainly iron ore, of which the Pilbara has the largest known reserves in the world. Radio Hill at Newman gives a panorama of the giant Mount Newman mine and the town that services it. From the lookout at Mungina Gorge, giving entry into the Hamersleys, we can clearly see the rugged red rock formations, so typical of this ancient tableland that has been broken into blocks by faulting, with the walls of the gorges composed of horizontal bands of iron. And as our trip diarist Ken Ablett notes, the cuttings look like slices of rainbow cake. Wittenoon, the base for our exploration of the Hamersley Range Park, puts us in sombre mood as we reflect on the town's tragic history. Blue asbestos has been both the life and the death of Wittenoon, which the government now wishes to close. The original town was built in 1947 near the mine, which closed in 1968. But following many deaths caused by asbestos dust, it was decided in 1978 to move the town further away. As if to endorse the danger that lies hidden here at Yampire Gorge, a death adder lurks at the entrance to one of the tunnels of a disused mine. As Duncan shows us a sample of blue asbestos, we pause in silent sympathy for the many families stricken by this killer substance that was once so highly valued. Our mood changes as the park ranger boards our coach to brief us on the magnificent Hamersley Range National Park, a rolling landscape of spectacular mountains, watercourses and plateaus. The mountains range up to about 720 meters, and temperatures can be extreme.
We have some interesting temperatures here. We range from -10 to the lowest that I've known. We had a -6 Wednesday before last.
Was it?
Yeah, and yeah, and it up to probably about 52 degrees.
The glory of the Hamersley Range, though, is its gorges, which now attract 60,000 visitors a year. Gorges like Calamina, with its beautiful clear springs, white gums and waterfalls. At Joffrey Gorge, we gaze over the edge of a vertical drop, with Duncan almost giving some of us a heart failure as he poses on the brink. From the vantage point of Oxer Lookout, we overlook the meeting of the gorges: Joffrey, Red, Hancock, Weeno and Knox. Weeno Gorge is so inviting that we walk right down to the floor of the gorge. And some of us venture in for a swim that can be best described as bracing. For those with sufficient energy in reserve, Dale's Gorge, with its circular pool and Fortescue Falls, is well worth the long climb down and back. Next morning, Whitnoon Gorge is our first scheduled break, but along the way, we stop briefly at a picturesque waterhole. The would-be artists among us yearn to paint the reflections of white ghost gums and spinifex-covered mountains, with bands of red rock making a horizontal pattern of contrasting colours. This seems as good a place as any to have a group photo taken, as this is one of the most memorable of the many beauty spots we've enjoyed. In Whitnoon Gorge, we see the original asbestos mine operated by Lang Hancock and the mining magnate's old home. Still, the gorge has come, out of Whitnoon and through Rio Tinto to Hamersley Gorge, where the folded bands of colourful rock fascinate us with tints of red, yellow, pink, white and purple. Before we leave the national park, we have a last lingering look back across the yellow spinifex to the ancient red raw mountains, feeling that although we now know them a little better, they still guard more secrets than will ever be uncovered by men like Lang Hancock. The contrast between the handiwork of nature and of man is brought home to us at our next overnight stop, the town of Tom Price. Tom who, you ask? Thomas Moore Price was a vice president of the American company Kaiser Steel, and it was his enthusiasm for the iron ore discoveries of Lang Hancock that ensured the development of mining in the Hamersleys. Tomorrow we'll have a closer look at the mine, but for tonight, after 2 magical days in the beauty of the national park, we just feel like singing. Along the red road to Karratha, we admire the profusion of Sturt's desert pea with its brilliant red petals set off by black centres. A picnic lunch by the banks of the beautiful Fortescue River in the Millstream National Park gives us another opportunity to reflect on the wealth of contrast in this spectacular region. Explorer and buccaneer William Dampier could hardly have been more excited at the sighting of the western coast of Australia than we are at the sighting of the Indian Ocean after our 7,000-kilometre overland journey across the entire continent. After all our overnight camping, we're ready now for some creature comforts, which are well catered for at the Overland Motor Inn at Karratha, the modern town which serves the deepwater port of Dampier. Before touring the port and the iron ore loading facilities, we learn from a slide presentation something of the immensity of the Hamersley iron operations.
Months later, the first warship was loaded at Dapia. By August of 1966, in one of the most remote areas of the globe, Hammersley built an open-cut mine, a 290-kilometre long standard gauge railway, a port, 2 towns, and the support facilities for the entire operations, including power generation and communication. Hammersley people look back on this massive effort with a mixture of pride and pain.
Communications in that time, we had to, if we wished to make a phone call, it was a drive of some 85 odd kilometres to Wittenoom.
On the long drive along the northwest coast via Port Hedland to Broome, Bill spins a few yarns while Duncan keeps the coach heading purposefully towards the famous old Port of Pearls. Although much of the old frontier town has disappeared under the weight of the tourist boom, there are lots of reminders of the days when Broome had a pearling fleet of more than 400 luggers. There's history aplenty here on Roebuck Bay, from Chinatown to the old lugger on the mudflats. From the Japanese cemetery, where so many divers lie, to the Japanese plane that reminds us of the wartime attack on Broome in 1942. From the old courthouse shipped to Broome by mistake in the late 1800s, to the Pearl Emporium that keeps alive the memory of the days when Broome was the world's pearling capital. And no visit to Broome would be complete without a walk on the 800-metre jetty, built to cope with the enormous rise and fall in tide levels, and greatly valued by anglers. At fashionable Cable Beach, sun lovers revel in the perfect weather and the clear blue water of the Indian Ocean, while not far away, tourists enjoy a less crowded setting. Along the road to Derby, we get our first close-up look at one of the famous boab trees that are to be found throughout the Kimberleys. Although Derby's jetty, built in 1966 but not used commercially since 1980, is not quite as long as Broome's, its semicircular design makes it an impressive sight, and as in Broome, it's an angler's dream. Derby still outdoes Broome in at least one thing. The 11-metre tidal range is the greatest in the Southern Hemisphere. Not far out of the old meatworks town is the notorious Prison Tree, a giant old boab with a girth of 14 metres, hollow, with only one entrance hole. We managed to cram 35 of our group inside, so at least the accommodation for the occasional prisoner was spacious, if not comfortable. The old cattle watering trough, although now disused, is a reminder of the big years of the Kimberley cattle industry. Built of concrete in 1920 and 120 metres long, it could water up to 1,000 cattle at a time from Myall's bore. As we turn off the Gibb River Road for Windjana Gorge, our expectations mount. Duncan has promised us some truly remarkable scenery in the Devonian Reef National Parks over the next 2 days. Windjana Gorge, Geeky Gorge and Tunnel Creek cut through the rugged limestone ranges that form part of Western Australia's famous Devonian Great Barrier Reef, which grew some 350 million years ago when the area was covered by a tropical sea. Windjana Gorge is one of the classic features of world geology, a picturesque, narrow canyon cut by the Leonard River through the range that was once a reef. At our lunch stop in the gorge, we're awed by the towering black and red cliffs with their serrated tops rising vertically from the sandy riverbed. On hand to welcome us are flocks of white and pink Major Mitchell parrots, and much less conspicuous and noisy, a blue-tongued lizard. This is crocodile country. inspecting the exposed Devonian reefs laid bare by the river millions of years ago, we're thankful that this magnificent natural feature is now protected for all time by its status as a national park. On now to Tunnel Creek, a remarkable tunnel cave that runs through the Napier Range. The 700-metre walk through the tunnel takes us along the sandy creek bed, which in parts is strewn with rocks and involves wading through water, sometimes up to 50 centimetres deep. Torches are essential here, as the interior of the tunnel is pitch black, except for a point halfway through, where there's a natural light shaft which reveals the colours in the tunnel walls and produces some beautiful reflections in the mirror-like pools. For us, it's back to the coach through the tunnel again, while the creek flows away through the trees like any normal stream. As always after our walk, we're glad to seek the comfort of our coach and particularly the air conditioning, which has served us well through the trip in a variety of weather conditions and insulated us from the dust on many unsealed roads we've travelled. We've seen some superb gorges so far on our long safari, but now we're all keyed up for the piece de resistance. Duncan gives top billing to the Geeky Gorge cruise on the mighty Fitzroy River not far from Fitzroy Crossing. This gorge was cut by the river over millions of years through the Geeky Gorge, which is another section of the Devonian Reef we saw at Winjana Gorge and Tunnel Creek, as our park ranger guide explains.
Over millennia, as the seas slowly retreated and the might of the Fitzroy River carved and eroded its way through the sedimentary rock formation, forming this large gorge we're now travelling through. In point of actual fact, what we are looking at here this morning is a fossilised Great Barrier Reef system.
As our boat cruises slowly upstream for 4 kilometres in the calm, deep waters of the Fitzroy, the bright early morning sunlight highlights the colours in the high limestone cliffs, their sawtooth tops sharp against the clear blue sky. Our guide explains that the clear demarcation between white and black on the cliff walls show the river height during the wet season floods, almost 20 metres above the present waterline. Travelling back downstream, we sight another croc or two, together with lots of bird life, including cormorants, darters, egrets and parrots. But it's on the way to our camp at Fitzroy Crossing that we come upon the bird-watching highlight of the trip, 2 large grey brolgas. This Australian member of the crane family was known to the early settlers as the native companion because it was often seen in the vicinity of Aboriginal camps. Time to strike our tents once more and head back over the Fitzroy River Bridge to rejoin the Great Northern Highway that will take us back to the Northern Territory. After a lunch stop where we admire the white gums and wattle at Barangi Creek, we press on to Halls Creek, Western Australia's first gold rush town. The present tidy township is several kilometres from Old Halls Creek, which had a reputation as one of Australia's roughest and most rip-roaring mining towns. Today there's little left except the remains of some mud brick buildings and the old cemetery, with the scene incongruously dominated by a huge licensed restaurant to cater for tourists fascinated by Halls Creek's robust heritage. Although the golden days have gone, there is still a lot of prospecting in the area, and the China Wall, the huge outcrop of white quartz that breaks the surface intermittently for hundreds of kilometres, spurs the hopes of those who still dream of the big strike. Halls Creek is mainly cattle country now, and the industry still depends heavily on the stockmen who help make it great. Two of them are in town today, and as they ride off, they evoke memories of We of the Never Never. It's cattle country, and it's bull dust country. Again, we give thanks for the co-chair air conditioning as we leave the bitumen to traverse nearly 1,000 kilometres of gravel track, including the once notorious Tanami Desert. At Wolf Creek Meteorite Crater, we literally stretch our legs as we climb up the rim and then down into the centre of the crater, thought to have been formed millions of years ago when a meteorite crashed into the Earth. At last, the territory border, and as the sun sets on the Tanami track, we prepare for another night, another sing-along by the campfire in the great outback. Co-driver Bill surprises us with his didgeridoo talents and his knowledge of both the traditional instrument and the white man's imitation.
Capture that one.
Flat Roadhouse may be one of the most remote in Australia. In view of the isolation, no one begrudges the fuel prices. 99 cents a litre for petrol and 95 cents for diesel. Lonely or not, wild horses couldn't drag the proprietor away. He's been here with his family for 20 years. After the long stretch of unsealed track, and with more than 10,000 kilometres covered so far, Duncan is pleased to see that the Toyo tyres on the coach are in good shape. Bunking down at the Red Centre Resort for the first of our 2 nights in Alice Springs, we look forward to exploring this city in the centre. The history of the Alice is tied up with the solutions to the problems of isolation, and in this, the overland telegraph line and John Flynn's pedal wireless played crucial roles. The old telegraph station is at the site of the original springs, named for the wife of Sir Charles Todd, who was responsible for the overland telegraph line that established the historic link between Adelaide and Darwin in 1872. A rainy day curtails some of our scheduled program. Until the weather clears, we content ourselves with some indoor places of interest, such as the Diorama Village, a well-presented depiction of Aboriginal Dreamtime legends. The end of the rain sees us heading out through the Heavy Tree Gap, the only southern exit from Alice Springs through the McDonnell Ranges, on the way to beautiful Emily Gap. Back in town, some of the group visit the remarkable Panorama Guth, a circular painting that is viewed from a central platform, giving the impression of a lookout over Central Australia's main scenic features. With attractions like this, the Alice is heavily tourist-oriented, yet in other ways, this typical Australian city is still in pioneer mode. Sunrise at Boulia, our first stop after crossing back into Queensland, and we're awakened by the shrill squawking of hundreds of galahs as they take flight from the trees on the riverbank. It can be hot out here on the endless plains, and the shimmering heat waves bring thoughts of the mirages that once tortured thirsty men trudging the outback tracks. Which brings us to the interesting old Hamilton Hotel, where for once, graffiti is welcome. The walls and ceilings are covered with the names and comments of visitors who've paid for the privilege by making a donation to the Flying Doctor Service. None of the graffiti throws any light on the Min Min mystery, but the publican is more forthcoming about the legendary Will-o'-the-Wisp light, said to be first seen at Min Min, a lonely hotel near Boulia, and long since burnt down.
He used to shoot up on the same station up here for about 4 years, and he said at night time, some nights there, he'd be out there in the middle of the paddock somewhere, and he'd be driving around and shooting roos and that type of thing.
He didn't take rum with him?
No, he didn't drink it at night time. Yeah, well, he reckoned, you know, like in through the trees there'd be a light somewhere, and he knows he's the only one out there, and he'd be driving around, he'd just shooting roos and that, and there'd be a light, just stay about 100 yards over that way and just following around.
After coming so far across the plains, the Cawnpore Range offers a welcome change of scenery, and from the top, we can see the ribbon of bitumen winding through the gorge. Now we're headed for Winton and the waltzing Matilda country. Few urban Australians have ever camped on the banks of a billabong, and fewer still could recognise a coolabah tree. But thanks to the banjo, these features of the outback have become nostalgic symbols of Australia. A sign on the accommodation at lonely Middleton Hotel proves that the wry humour of the West is still alive and well out here. The long reach of the Thompson River reminds us that we're back on that confusing river system we encountered at Cooper's Creek. The Thompson and the Barcoo combine to form the Cooper, so we've almost come full circle. Rearing up from the plain in a way that reminds us of Ayers Rock, the Stockman's Hall of Fame honours the pioneers of the West in a magnificent presentation of videos, dioramas, paintings and photographs, all housed in a striking building which, although is as modern as tomorrow, is reminiscent of the simple, improvised yet eminently practical bush architecture of the pioneers. Thousands of visitors now visit the Hall of Fame each week, and Hugh Saury, R.M. Williams and other visionaries who made their dream into reality have ensured a place in the Australian consciousness for the self-reliant men and women who just got on with the job in the great outback. With our inland odyssey nearing its end, we gather on the steps of the Hall of Fame, glad to have seen so much of the country that sometimes defeated, sometimes rewarded, but always challenged those honoured at Longreach. A friendly sing-song with other caravan park dwellers is a pleasant finale to the day. And in tribute to Duncan, we accord him musical honours, with apologies to Slim Dusty.
When the atmosphere is great, I love to have a beer with Duncan, 'cause Duncan's me mate. I love to have a beer with Duncan, 'cause Duncan's me mate. Hey!
Our last day in the outback passes smoothly on the run south through Barcaldine, Blackall and Augathella to Roma, where we're to spend the final night of the expedition in the comfort of the Overlander Motel. At dinner, we express our thanks to Duncan, Bill and Ella for their care and attention during the 28 days and some 12,000 kilometres of trouble-free touring.
And thank you very much. It was great to be, well, it was a reunion, wasn't it, Ted? A lot of us have been so many times together. We've enjoyed each other's company, and I was very happy to have you all there this year. Thank you very much, and thank you for this gift. And next year, well, I've got something in store. I don't know how it's all working out yet.
Tomorrow we'll see us dropping off passengers on the way back to Brisbane. But for now, we're all here to relive the highlights of a memorable month spent crossing and recrossing the continent.
Well, it's music.
Every part of it was wonderful. Yeah, that's all I can say, I think. Gorgeous, everything.
Would you recommend this as the way to go?
To everybody,
Yeah.
I would.
What reasons would you give for that? I mean,
Wonderful head man, wonderful coach driver, and our, mates.
Yeah.
Companionship, yeah, wonderful.
Best of all, I think I loved the campfire concerts.
Just outstanding to see it.
Having been in this man's hands for 28 days, we can only say, Duncan Polley, you've coached us well.